She stood in the kitchen, her hair still messy from the night before, wearing the same outfit she left in. She didn't even bother changing. I sat at the table, drinking my coffee slowly, refusing to look up. Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I didn't want her to see me. If she caught my eyes in that moment, she'd know everything. How I didn't sleep. How I imagined 100 different outcomes. How I checked my phone more times than I could count, each time hoping for something that never came. A message, a call, anything. Instead, there was only silence until the early hours when the garage door finally creaked open. Now she stood 6 feet away, pretending this was fine, pretending like she didn't cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She tried to act normal. She tried to smile, soft and guilty like it would smooth things over. I didn't smile back. I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. I stared at the wall behind her and let her walk around me like I wasn't even there. And I could feel the tension in her steps, the uncertainty in how she poured her coffee, the forced casualness in how she asked, "Want me to make you something?" I shook my head once and kept my lips sealed. That was the only answer she got from me. Because the truth was, she went to that party knowing exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about control. It wasn't about me trying to dictate her life or cage her in. I had no problem with her going out. Hell, I wanted her to see her friends, to live her life. But this party, that party, was something else entirely. It wasn't just any gathering. It was the one thrown by her ex's best friend. The same ex she swore she had nothing to do with anymore. The same guy who had a habit of circling back into her life whenever things weren't perfect. She'd told me 100 times that it was over, that he was part of the past, that she didn't even think about him anymore. And maybe I would have believed that if I hadn't seen how she hesitated when she told me about the invite. She said it casually one night while we were brushing our teeth, like it didn't matter. "So, Julie is throwing a party Saturday. I might stop by." But I saw the flicker in her eyes, the tiny pause before she said Julia's name, as if she rehearsed it, as if she was omitting the part that mattered. I didn't say anything then. I just nodded. But 2 days later, when I was on the phone with a friend who happened to know people in that circle, the truth spilled out. It wasn't just Julia's party. It was a reunion of that entire college group, the one that always revolved around him. And suddenly, the way she smiled when she brought it up made more sense. She wasn't just seeing old friends. She was stepping back into that familiar orbit, the one she said she'd outgrown. I didn't confront her right away. I watched, observed, waited to see if she'd come clean. She didn't. Instead, she talked around it, vague and breezy, always saying a few people from school, like that meant nothing. And when Saturday came, she dressed carefully, not flashy, too smart for that, but intentional. Hair loose, makeup subtle but sharp, perfume I hadn't smelled on her in over a year. She checked her phone constantly, said she'd be back around midnight, kissed me like it was routine, and left with that same calm confidence that always pissed me off when she knew she was doing something wrong. I didn't text her, didn't call. I wasn't going to be that guy, but I also didn't sleep. I laid in bed and stared at the ceiling as the hours dragged on. Midnight came and went. 1:30. 2. At 2:30, I heard the garage. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I waited for the creak of the door, the shuffle of her feet. I pretended to sleep when she walked in. She didn't even check if I was awake. And now it was morning, and we were in the same room, pretending like things were normal, but everything between us had shifted. This wasn't about the party anymore. This was about trust, about respect, about knowing the one person you love most in the world looked you in the eyes, told you something half-true, and hoped you'd be too dumb or too soft to notice. But I noticed, and in that silence, as she buttered her toast and glanced over to see if I was going to speak, I made a decision. I was done asking for honesty. I was done hoping for respect. I wasn't going to raise my voice or beg for explanations. No, I was going to handle this my way. She went to that party knowing I didn't approve. She walked through that door like nothing happened. And the next morning, I ignored her all day. But that was only the beginning. I wish I could say I had a clear plan right away, that I knew exactly how I wanted this to go. But the truth is, I was lost in that silence, burning slowly with every minute she moved around the house like she hadn't shattered something. She laughed at her phone like nothing was wrong. She asked if I wanted to go out later, like we were good. I nodded, but my stomach twisted. She thought I was sulking. She thought I'd get over it in a day or two. Maybe sleep with my back turned, snap at her once or twice, then move on. And if I'm being honest, maybe I would have. Maybe I would have let it go, forced myself to forget, if it hadn't been for what happened that night. I couldn't sleep again. She was beside me, breathing softly, completely relaxed, like guilt didn't exist in her world. I got up around 2 a.m. and walked out to the living room, phone in hand, and I stared at it for a long time before I opened it. I didn't want to become the guy who snooped. The guy who checked her apps, her messages, her history. I wanted to believe I was better than that. But that night, I wasn't. I opened her Instagram first. Nothing strange. Then texts. Still clean. But then I checked the shared photo album we used to sync pictures. The one she always forgot was connected. There it was. A photo taken in the bathroom mirror of that house. His house. I knew the tile. I knew the damn wallpaper. She had taken it at the party. The timestamp was clear. She looked tipsy, flushed cheeks, red cup in hand, smiling into the camera with two other people I vaguely recognized from stories she'd told. But it was the hand that caught my eye, resting on her lower back. Just fingertips, barely visible, but I knew. I fucking knew. That was him. I didn't yell. I didn't wake her up. I just sat there and let that rage settle in, quiet and cold. There was no cheating. Not yet. Not provable. But there was something. There was intention. There was deceit. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. I felt played. Not just betrayed, patronized. Like she thought she could get away with walking into fire and come back pretending she hadn't smelled the smoke. The next morning, I was different. I laughed at her jokes. I kissed her on the forehead. I offered to make breakfast. And I saw her relax. She thought I had let it go. She even thanked me for understanding. That word stuck to my ribs like poison. Understanding. I didn't understand anything except this. The version of me she thought she knew was dead. I wasn't going to be the quiet one anymore. I wasn't going to wait to be disrespected again. I spent the next few days in observation mode. Learning. Watching. Picking up her tells, her routines, her laziness in covering her tracks. I noticed how she always left her phone unlocked when she was in the shower. I noticed the friend she texted the most suddenly stopped being mentioned out loud. I noticed how she deleted certain notifications, but not the messages themselves, thinking that was enough. Every clue, every carelessly hidden scrap of dishonesty became a thread. And I started pulling. Quietly. Methodically. Not to explode. Not to confront. But to dismantle. It started with a list. Not a dramatic one written in rage or crossed with red ink. Just a simple note in my phone. A timeline. A pattern. A place to collect every inconsistency. Every time she told me she was going one place, but the map history showed another. Every time she deleted a message mid-conversation, only for the response to show up later with no context. I cataloged it all. Screenshots, photos, times and dates. If this was going to mean anything, it had to be airtight. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted a moment she couldn't crawl out of. A mirror held so close she couldn't look away. Next, I quietly reached out to the one person I trusted more than anyone else, my brother. We weren't the kind to talk emotions, but we understood loyalty. I told him everything. I didn't need advice. I needed his help with the logistics. Borrowing gear, setting up things subtly. A few cameras. Nothing invasive, just positioned smartly. One in the living room, one facing the hallway by the door. I wasn't expecting a full-on scandal. I just needed verification, proof of intention. And if she was innocent? Fine. I could live with being paranoid once. But I wasn't wrong. The real breakthrough came the following Friday. She said she was going to a late dinner with her coworker Megan. I smiled, told her to have fun, even handed her the coat she liked best. 2 hours later, the hallway camera caught her leaving again, but this time dressed differently. Heels, different top, makeup retouched. She had come back from dinner, changed, and left again without saying a word. The timestamp burned into my memory. I didn't follow her. I didn't call. I just noted the time and waited. The next morning, I asked how her night was. She smiled and said Megan was hilarious as always. I asked what they ate. She said sushi. I asked which restaurant. She hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough. It's new. By the river, she said, sipping her coffee. I just smiled. We should go sometime. Yeah, definitely, she said, eyes on her phone. That was it. That was the moment I knew the plan was no longer theory. It was action. I wasn't going to expose her right then and there. I wasn't interested in the dramatic fight. I wanted her to think she was safe, that she had fooled me. Because when I finally showed her the truth, I wanted it to land like a brick wall. Not loud, but final. I knew the date had to matter. The reveal had to land like an anvil. Not during some petty argument, not in the middle of another lie, but in a moment where the silence would feel like thunder. I chose our anniversary. It might sound cruel, but that was the point. She had desecrated our trust in silence. I was going to answer with precision. 2 weeks out, I began to lay the groundwork. Nothing obvious. I was sweeter than usual. Attentive. I asked her about her day. I cooked dinner more often. I told her she looked beautiful when she didn't expect it. I was, in short, the version of me she remembered from when we first started dating. Before the indifference, before the doubts, before the fracture. And she responded exactly the way I needed her to. She relaxed. She leaned into it. She let her guard down, thinking I had forgiven her. She started planning our anniversary weekend, suggesting a cabin 2 hours outside the city, something quiet, just the two of us. I agreed like I couldn't wait. And while she packed weekend bags and scrolled Airbnb listings, I finalized everything else. I printed every screenshot, every map location, every text log. I exported photos, including the one with his hand on her back. I even included the moment she walked out the door dressed one way and returned home dressed another, captured cleanly by the hallway camera. It was a folder full of facts, timestamps, choices, not accusations, just the unfiltered truth. Then I added a letter, a single page, not angry, not vindictive, just final. I wrote, "You built this relationship on honesty. I believed in that for too long. What I've attached are not assumptions. They are not guesses. They are the evidence of choices you made with full agency. You owed me the truth. Instead, you gave me silence and half-stories. I loved you. I trusted you. And I watched you gamble that away." I placed it all in an envelope and slipped it into the glove compartment of her car. That Friday, we drove to the cabin. The air was crisp, fall barely holding onto the last yellow leaves. She played her playlist. We sang. She laughed. And I did too. But underneath it, I was counting the hours, waiting for the last note to play. When we arrived, she lit a candle in the cabin, poured us wine, pulled me close, and whispered, "I'm glad we're doing better. I missed us." I kissed her. I held her. I even told her I missed us too. And then I said, "Hey, can you grab the phone charger from the glove box? I think I left mine in there." She didn't question it. She took the keys, stepped outside, and walked to the car. Minutes passed. No footsteps returned. No door opened. I sat on the couch, listening. Finally, the door creaked open. But she didn't speak. When I turned, she was standing in the entryway, envelope in hand, face pale. "What is this?" she asked, voice flat. I stood up slowly, met her eyes, and said, "That's your honesty. On paper. With receipts." She stared at me like she didn't know who I was. And maybe she didn't. Maybe she never expected me to be this composed, this calculating. "You went through my phone? You spied on me? That's insane. That's manipulative." I nodded. "You're right. I did. After you lied. After you said you were at dinner with Megan and left the house again in different clothes. After you took a photo in your ex's house and didn't say a word. I did all of that because you broke the rules first." She stepped back like I had slapped her. "So what? You brought me here to dump me? To humiliate me?" "I brought you here," I said, walking past her, "so you'd have somewhere quiet to think about what you've done. You can take the car in the morning. I'm getting a ride back. Don't worry." "You're just leaving?" I turned at the door, held her gaze one more time, and said, "No, I'm not leaving. I already left. 2 weeks ago. You just didn't notice." She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat on the couch with the envelope in her lap, flipping through every page, every moment she thought she'd hidden. And I walked out into the night, my bag over my shoulder, breathing air that felt clean for the first time in months. I didn't answer her texts. I didn't pick up when she called. I didn't rage post, didn't trash her to mutual friends. I didn't need to. The truth had spoken clearly enough. And in the weeks that followed, I watched her try to rewrite the story, but no one believed her. Because I didn't tell lies. I didn't exaggerate. I just held up a mirror. And sometimes, that's all revenge needs to be. She opened the envelope with hands that trembled in a way that I did not expect to feel satisfaction from watching. And as she flipped through the pages and the photographs and the screenshots, I watched something else happen too. The comfortable narrative she had rehearsed in her head for weeks, maybe months, started to unravel quietly in the dim light of that cabin living room while outside the trees bent into autumn and the wind made small, honest noises against the roof, and she looked up at me once, only once, with a face that asked 1,000 questions and offered nothing in the way of answers. And when she spoke, her voice did not have the practiced defense I had heard before when she deflected my questions with half-truths and jokes, but instead it was raw and small and oddly human in a way I had not permitted myself to recognize for a long time. And she said, "How could you do this to me? How could you go through my things, place cameras in my life, and then bring this here like some kind of verdict?" And I answered, not by raising my voice or by constructing the kind of dramatic speech she might have expected from a lover who felt betrayed, but by leaning against the mantel and letting the silence do some of the work I had learned silence could do over months of planting seeds and collecting evidence. And I told her, "I did what I did because you left me with no other honest option. You chose to make decisions in the dark and present them at dawn as if nothing had occurred. And when you chose omission over conversation, you gave me reason to gather what you would not offer me freely. And I chose a quiet clarity instead of a spectacle, because the spectacle had always been your refuge, and I wanted you to see, plainly, the cost of those choices without the noise of a fight to distract from the facts." And she lowered her head and pressed the photos to her chest like she could smother what they showed. And in that moment, I felt the exact, complicated, and unexpected mixture of emotions I had been bracing for. Satisfaction tempered by a hollowness that came from recognizing that the act of revealing cannot itself rebuild what trust once was, and that revenge, even when executed perfectly and without cruelty, changes the avenger in ways that are not always visible in the hours after the deed is done. In the days that followed my leaving, which was a quiet, almost bureaucratic act more than a dramatic exodus, the structure of our shared world collapsed not in an explosive scene, but in a series of small, inexorable, administrative, unglamorous things. Mutual friends texted me to ask what had happened after seeing cryptic social posts. And when I did not supply melodrama, the story settled into cleaner lines because I refused to embroider it, and she reached out in waves of increasingly contrite messages that attempted to stitch the seam she had ripped, each one of them a different shade of apology, some asking for explanations, and others offering half-confessions. And I answered only occasionally and with a brevity that had a surgical intent, because I wanted to ensure there was no misreading of my motives. And I wanted to be fair in the way I described what had transpired, so that those who had trusted me would not wonder whether my silence had been a prelude to falsehood. And slowly, predictably, people who had once straddled both of our lives started to pick sides, not with a chorus of judgment, but with the pragmatic logic of social currency. If someone had been shown facts, and those facts bore out by timestamps and photos and logs, then supporting the person who revealed them was not always an endorsement of cruelty, but often in alignment with a principle we all pretend to value until it hits too close to home. And like that, I found myself simultaneously relieved by the absence of spectacle and unsettled by the cold efficiency of how quickly relationships recalibrated when given incontrovertible evidence instead of rumors. She tried, briefly and with a visible strain that looked like auditioning for absolution, to turn the narrative back toward a common ground by inviting our mutual friends for coffee and by sending group messages full of irony and self-deprecating humor that used laughter as a form of armor. And for a moment, I wondered if the theater of reconciliation would work, because habit is a kind of gravity that can pull people back into old orbits. But the photographs she now had pinned to her metaphorical sleeve like a map of her missteps prevented her from finding her footing in that theater. There is a distinct humiliation that comes from holding the physical proof of your own choices in your hands while trying to convince others of a contrary story. And it's a vulnerability that performs its own kind of justice because it leaves no room for the performative theatrics of spin. And so she retreated into a quieter kind of social life, the kind that does not demand a presence in every group chat or an appearance at every weekend brunch. And in those quieter spaces, she seemed to be doing something that looked to me like the hardest part of the aftermath, which is not the immediate sting of exposure, but the slow grinding work of learning how to live with the person you used to be, the one capable of choosing omission over truth, and whether or not she intended to transform, whether or not she deserved forgiveness, became beside the point to me, because I had learned that the point of my actions was never to punish her into change, but rather to reclaim my own dignity by refusing to inhabit a life where being patronized was mistaken for being cared for. There were practical consequences too, not the headline-grabbing revenge fantasies of ruin, but the meticulous unspooling of shared routines that used to bind us together in ways both sweet and banal. We divided the apartment's furniture as pragmatically as though we were sorting old records. We contacted our landlord and agreed to a schedule for who would take what and when. We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table to sign papers that severed shared obligations, and these acts, mundane and precise, had a strange dignity to them because they treated our separation less like a battlefield and more like a necessary recalibration with an emphasis on fairness rather than vindictiveness. And in conversations with my brother I admitted, in a way I had not allowed myself to phrase before, that part of my motive had been to force an honest accounting not only so others would see what she had done, but so that I could stop occupying a space where doubt had become the central character in our relationship. And by insisting on clarity, I reclaimed the right to make decisions on a foundation that was not riddled with fuzzy compromises or secret omissions. And though there were nights when I felt the ache of loneliness press against the sides of my chest like a cautious animal, I also felt a steadier pulse of relief in the morning because I no longer spent whole afternoons turning over small suspicions and building them into private narratives that exhausted me from the inside out. The revenge that unfolded, measured and deliberate rather than dramatic, left me with results that were both sweet in their immediacy and complicated in their aftermath, because seeing a person confronted with her own pattern of deception and watching the flimsy scaffolding of excuses collapse under the weight of facts had the satisfying, almost mercantile quality of justice rendered in currency people could understand. Yet at the same time it revealed a new landscape I had not expected to navigate. Friends who assumed the worst of all parties, people who quietly distanced themselves to avoid aligning with conflict, colleagues who sent messages that began with, "I've heard," and then paused because rumors are unwieldy and inconvenient. And through it all, I learned that truth, once displayed, does not always restore things to their original state. It creates a different order entirely, and that order asks you to live differently, and sometimes painfully, because the world will treat you differently once you are known for taking action rather than tolerating erosion of your dignity. And I found in myself an unexpected reserve of patience for the awkward, slow processes of re-establishing trust with people who had been watching from the sidelines and do not always understand the private calculus that led to my choices. So when nights came and I lay awake thinking about whether I had been cruel, about whether revenge had hollowed out part of me that would have been better served by forgiveness, I did not invent moral frameworks to soothe myself with proclamations of righteousness. Instead, I counted the tangible things. The nights I no longer spent inventing scenarios to fill silences. The mornings I woke up without immediately scanning my phone for evidence of some omission. The small, practical pleasures of doing my own laundry, of eating cereal from a bowl that no longer had to be shared in the pretense of domestic togetherness. And I realized that the satisfaction I felt was not a simple triumph over another person, but a reclamation of a life that had been diluted by doubt, and that the revenge I had chosen was a means of restoring the boundaries that allow an ordinary human being to live without constant negotiation of their worth, and in the quiet aftermath, beneath the surface-level victories and the necessary logistical divides, there was a deeper recognition that living honestly toward oneself requires acts that are sometimes messy, sometimes painful, and sometimes irreversible, and that the clearest revenge is often the one that brings you back to yourself rather than smashing the other person into ruin for the sake of spectacle. Finally, and perhaps most unexpectedly, what remained after the dust settled was not a triumphant narrative to be paraded before friends, nor a score settled that I could tally and enjoy in private. Instead, it was the slow reassembling of my days with an attention to detail I had not afforded them while trust was being chipped away, and this reassembly had its own quiet pleasures. I took walks without rehearsing conversations in my head. I learned to sit in silence without suspicion. I allowed myself to be kind to strangers in ways that did not serve as substitute intimacy. I reconnected with my brother over stories that had nothing to do with betrayal. And in the reflective evenings when the house was still and the city a distant pulse, I would sometimes find myself thinking of her not with the sharpness of wanting to wound, but with a more complex Human memory of someone who had been both companion and mirror and had, in choosing omission, taught me something I could not have learned otherwise, which is that dignity is not a static possession but a practice that requires defense, that the most satisfying revenge may be less about the other person's suffering and more about your clear-eyed return to a life that feels worth living without apology. And while I did not emerge unscarred, I did emerge with a new economy of honesty in which I spent my words more carefully and required less from silence, and that, when measured against the small betrayals that once made me ache, felt like a revenge that had cost me something but had paid me back in the truest currency I had been seeking all along. The ability to look at myself in the mirror and know I had chosen integrity over easy forgetting.